Uh, Effenus Henderson is one of the OGs of DEI, practitioners and professionals. He was the lead convener of ISO 30415. I think you spent, but correct me if I'm wrong, a good 10 years working on developing and delivering this standard to all of us from 2011, 2010. Right. It started with Sherm. I think a lot of folks know that story, but if anyone doesn't, one of the other business cases, just as a business guy, for this forum and this group to expand is the modern context. You all probably saw Sherm, the Society for Human Resources Management, delete the word equity from its core principles or mandate a few weeks ago. There was a bit of an uproar about that. About 10 years ago, Effenus and a bunch of other folks were meeting. I think Dr. BA and Lorelei and other folks were at the Society for Human Resources Management to try to just build a consensus around what we all mean by DEI or what a chief diversity officer is. Again, so this is 1,000 years ago in tech time, 10 years is. And Sherm got out of the standards writing business, just how they kind of got out of the equity business. And I think the interesting thing is diversity and inclusion usually sits in the human resources suite at any company right now. This is a time where we're seeing a differentiation between what HR is and what DEI professionals are and how they're certified. And we even heard Meyer and Nisar, the lawyer from yesterday, talk about how lawyers or employment lawyers in his space really look at HR as risk managers and protectors of the status quo. So not as empathetic and grand as we normally hear people talking about HR folks. Apologies to anyone who has a SHRM certification or think they're doing God's great work as HR professionals. You are all good. Everybody is pretty. Everybody is kind, right? But formally, right, from a business standpoint, we want to differentiate how DEI professionals interact with HR professionals as they also would interact with procurement and supplier diversity professionals. And so as Sherm got out of that business, Effenus and Co. took this work to the International Organization for Standards, and we've seen it sprawl. Now we've got this consensus that we can use to dissect DEI, business processes, and going forward. And again, one of the biggest components, which we talk about a lot in the course, and how we distribute DEI and incentivize companies to do it well, is through the coalescing of employees or stakeholders of sorts. And so Effenus is going to give us a very detailed rundown on ERGs. So I'll bring them up now. I think feel free to cut them off and beat them up and ask crazy questions. I think he likes that. So Effenus Henderson, everybody. Yeah. Yeah, for anyone who missed that, they're also participating with this National Science Foundation project. That's what Greta was saying way over here, if you're way over there. We got a mic for anyone later. So raise your hand, I'll run over to you. All right.
Well, good morning, everybody. How are you? And see, I'm standing up here and say, I think most of these people know what an ERG is. How many do not know what an ERG is? How many have ERGs? Hmm? How many, you have an ERG? Just raise your hands. How many have ERGs in the room? Okay, great, great. So I've developed this presentation a while ago, so I may skip some slides, go through it, because I want this to be interactive. I want to understand, in today's environment, how your ERGs are functioning, what's their purpose, how they align with the organization's mission, vision, and values, and how people feel about their experience. And are you having the challenges that a lot of ERGs have with turnover, with leadership, and those kinds of things? First of all, I hail from Seattle, but I grew up in North Carolina. I went to an HBCU, North Carolina Central University. It beat Morgan State on Saturday for its homecoming. So I was kind of happy about that. My sons are from here, so I love the opportunity to come to Atlanta and visit because all three of them are Morehouse graduates, and their families are here, and it's a treasure to be back here. So today, what I'd like to do is just share a little bit more about what I think an ERG is and how it has evolved. So let me start with a question from anybody in the group. What's the difference between an affinity group, an ERG, or a BRG, or a diversity council? Who would like to just chime in? Anyone know? What's the difference between an affinity group? The affinity group, well, I'll give you the answer. The affinity groups sort of were the first iteration of employee resource groups. And they were designed because people wanted to come together because of an affinity, some common bond or identity-based characteristic that they felt they wanted to share. And it was really led by employees. It wasn't really connected to organizational priorities, mission, and values. It was just groups coming together in the workplace. From there, with diversity becoming much more of a priority, there was a connection. They're saying there is a business case for moving these groups from affinity-based groups to more what we call ERGs, employee resource groups, with the intent that these groups would be a group that could provide insights into how the organization operates and so forth in terms of its mission, its values, and in terms of employee engagement, satisfaction, intent to stay, and so forth. So lots of things that these groups could do to help support the organization. I worked in the private industry for 40 years. I was an employee in HR for a Weyerhaeuser company, a major company like Georgia Pacific here, but headquartered in Seattle. And we had 8, I think, when I left, employee resource groups, and I'll talk more about those and how they support the organization as a whole. But I want you, as I go through this, to stop me and say, hey, I have a question, I don't understand, blah, 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 because I'm going to move pretty quickly through this. So I have an agenda, and if you would move to the next slide, or can I do that from here? Just kind of give you an overview of ERGs and the different types, some tools and tips for getting started, the chartering process, because there is a chartering process, how to develop goals and objectives for an ERG, and some useful metrics. And I don't profess to be the authority on that because I think some of you in the room probably have just as much skill and background in this area. So if you want to lean into that and share a little bit about what you're doing within your organization, that's fine as well. Next slide. So again, a brief overview, how to get them started, some strategic planning, the process. You just don't come together and do a potluck and talk about things. Oftentimes the best types of ERGs are those that have an annual calendar and they work on something that's over several years and so forth. So just want to share a little bit more about that. So raise your hand again. How many of you have ERGs? Who is a member of one of those ERGs? Now raise your hand. Okay. So let me just hear from you what your which ERG and what you're doing. Just a quick question here in terms of your ERG. Right here.
Well, in our organization in Canada, I'm in a public institution. I'm in healthcare, and we call them communities of practice. And they're a little bit different than ERGs. They're kind of like what you're describing. They'll have a terms of reference, and they'll kind of function as a little committee. But they are identity-based. So I'm a part of a BIPOC community of practice. And so we have, we develop programs, like we now have a coaching and mentoring program for BIPOC professionals in the organization. But ERGs are something that is not as popular. We call them communities of practice. I think they function the same way, but that was a question I have for you, if you're familiar with communities of practice and if that's the same thing.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with them, but I would say they may have some of the same characteristics. Usually an ERG is founded around a particular identity-based characteristic. Generally, they're fairly open. You know, in organizations you can't discriminate. So, for example, if you have a black employees ERG, it has to be open to everyone in the organization. You can't just say only black people can attend. You can say black folks, their allies, and anyone who's interested in helping to advance the numbers of people of color or African Americans in the workplace. That would be a way you'd have to design that type of program. Yes.
So we're just getting started implementing ERGs in my role. And one of the interesting dynamics that we're working through, and our goal is to give those groups, identity groups, a voice in our inclusion work so that they have a clear pathway to infuse their thinking about inclusion into the work that we're doing and implementing. But one of the questions that has come up for me is, I'm not, I wasn't born in America, and so I'm of Caribbean ethnicity or nationality. So when you asked about, are you a part of the group? I'm asking the leader of the Black or the African American ERG, am I a part of your group? You know, is it an African American ERG or is it a Black ERG? And so that's an interesting question that I wonder if you could speak to that in terms of identities and intersectionality in ERGs.
Well, I think in that case, you know, you would probably be part of that group. It all depends on how the organization and the group is defining itself and how it's chartered. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few. But I would say in that case, you're probably part of it, because anyone, allies who have an affinity for that type of group, you know, can be a part of that. So let's just kind of go through a little bit more of the slides very quickly. Oh, one more question. Did I miss one? Yeah, okay.
So ERG is essentially absent from my work environment. However, here at the University of Georgia, we created a plan for an affinity group. I served as a charter member for that group, and we had kind of the aggressive goals of engagement, but also creating understanding of what our financial responsibilities would be for the university in order to get some of the things that we wanted back in return, understanding kind of what that process looked like, and then also leadership. And so I rolled off of that particular affinity group because the idea is to roll off like a regular board to allow others the opportunity to participate and to create a pipeline. When we rolled off, we had the goal of rolling on to the actual boards that were at the university already. And so I'm now the first African American to serve on the Board of Arts and Sciences, but we've brought other African Americans behind me. We've also brought some Hispanics behind me as well, and we're continuing that effort, and the university is really responsive. We also had Greek Life. I'm a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We had us to create a scholarship, raise $240,000 to endow scholarships for both faculty and for students, and kind of set that as the goal for what we would like to see other organizations do around campus who are not the traditional or who might be marginalized. And so those efforts are starting to find their way as well. And as a response, President Moorhead gifted us for the first time after over 50 years of asking for it, a Greek garden. And so people are starting to understand we have not just affinity, but we also have power. We also have leadership opportunities. We also have processes that we now understand. And the affinity group to this date has raised what we call the 1961 project, almost $1 million. If not, we may have tipped over $1 million with this year's homecoming, and understanding our responsibility around creating scenarios that make all of us feel like we're a part of this community, but in ways that we can really spread the wealth and continue understanding and continue movement.
Great, that's impressive. One of the things I will tell you, just listening to the dialogue just now, is that there's no cookie cutter approach to ERG. Some organizations even call them BRGs, business resource groups. The thing to do, as you started out, is really to define the definitions, to be clear on what it is the identities, the purpose of the group, and so forth. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. So don't think that there's one way to do it. You really have to shape it in the context of who you are, whether you're a university, a large corporation, a small corporation, a nonprofit, and so forth. So there's some basic principles, but they're not all the same in terms of how they're designed. In fact, some large companies have an ERG group with chapters of groups at different locations and so forth, just as an example. So what are ERGs? There are networks of employees that form the base for shared characteristics. They are usually focused on the common needs of that identity-based group. And they advocate for themselves. They generally will have something called an executive sponsor. And a lot of times the focus is on talent development, mentoring, those kinds of things. So let's just move. I'm just going to move through these very quickly. And move to the next slide right there. Types of ERGs. The earliest example, just to give you a little bit of history, goes all the way back to Xerox in 1970, when they formed their National Black Employees Caucus to help support the development of African Americans in the organization. And then since that time, there have been a lot of different types of ERGs and so forth. Some are race-based or gender-based, some are LGBT-based, some are or around age-based. Like we had one, the Gen X group, a group of young professionals who wanted to think about how they could advance in the organization, what it takes to get ahead. So they had a lot of work focused around talent development, mentoring, and those kinds of things. The key thing there, members include people from these groups, but they're not, or they're allies who want to help, so they don't have to be. And that's one of the things I want to stress to you, is that they're not discriminatory, or they're not exclusive. They have to be inclusive in the design, even though they're focused on a particular group. Next slide. Yes. Yeah, I would say that the individual who wants to be an ally would decide. You're not.
Okay, let me ask it again.
Okay.
So just a curiosity around, you said it's people who share that identity or experience and their allies. Just curious about who decides they're the ally, the group or the individual?
Well, yes.
One of the ways we addressed that up front, because that was a big concern from our LGBTQIA community, was that we instituted a policy that allies need to do allyship training to be a part of the group, so that they understand just basically what is allyship. And we have a little micro learning for that. And then there's two other kind of training things that if you want to remain a part of a group that has an identity that you don't share, that you have to pursue to just continue, make sure that you understand allyship is about standing beside or standing behind, not being out front.
Great, thank you. Yes, back in the back.
So I think we also need to understand that the word ally is a very passive word, right? And so we need to be talking about active allyship, right? This is not a passive thing that one just does. Also, getting the title of ally is not something you can personally claim. When I say I'm an ally to the Black community, I don't just get to say that. the Black community has to give me that title and give me that, because I just can't claim it for myself, right? I have to prove my active allyship to the communities in which I do not identify. Now, in my organization, we do not have that, the restrictive kind of, if you want to be in the group, you need to take this training. I think that there might be some opportunities where that could create some type of exclusion. But I think it's also just making sure that you're really clear about, if you're coming to an employee resource group, that you are not a, you're not part of that identity, right? I am not somebody who is Black or Hispanic. I'm coming to that group because I want to learn, I want to support you. And yes, we use the term open to their and allies so that we can be inclusive, but it really has to make sure that you're coming to that space, being there to support and educate yourself. However, if somebody is choosing to be disruptive, then you're using your other policies and tools you have from a workplace, your anti-discrimination, your anti-harassment policies to control the behavior of individuals who are not choosing to practice active allyship when they're participating in those programs. So just be thinking about how you are being really clear about what ally is and what allyship is and what allyship isn't, and how you are making sure that you're giving people the space to learn and grow, but not claiming the title for themselves. So just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, and I think it varies by companies. Yes, next, another comment. Right. Wait.
Can I just ask my question really quickly?
Sure.
In my previous employment, we had ERGs, but one of them was for new employees. So employees who've been in the organization for less than 5 years. So no identity other than your newness to the organization, but it was called an ERG as the PRISM group that was to us LGBTQ plus, and there was one for a Black community. So I'm curious about how, I was thinking about this yesterday when we were talking about, does your organization at the onboarding let people invite them into the ERGs? And people in the organization, if you joined the organization, you were automatically part of the under 5 years ERG. You were automatically put on that email list, but not for the identity-based ones. And I was just curious, do you differentiate and say that's not actually an ERG? We were talking about creating, calling them an ERG and making the others all affinity groups because they were identity-based. This one wasn't. It had a purpose, it was networking, it was connecting employees who had just started, but it wasn't identity-based. I'm curious your thoughts on how you differentiate that.
Well, we had an ERG at Weyerhaeuser when I was there called the Gen X, the Generation Next, and it was essentially like yours, of the young professionals who wanted to come together. It wasn't based on a particular racial or gender-based or LGBT-based characteristics, but it was all young professionals coming into the organization who wanted to have things like mentoring, understanding how to coach people, onboard people, and so forth. So there is, I think, the opportunity to have a group clustered around something like that. We've even had some of the groups clustered around things like other interests, like I'm just trying to think of one, veterans, for example. We had a veterans employee resource group at Weyerhaeuser as well to help with folks who are coming out of the military and so forth. So a variety of ways. It all depends on how you want to structure it at the company, what the guidelines are, and what the broader DEI framework for your company is in terms of how to think about those. Yes?
I just wanted to make a comment about about allyship and ERGs. Okay, we do not have an ERG. We're creating these pilot communities of practice right now. That's more like a platform for folks to come together and talk about topics that are important to them. But I appreciate the approach with allies joining a group, and because I think the way I kind of envision ERGs, if we were to ever implement them, is that it's got to be a safe space for people that share identity and common needs to come together to have conversations. So if there's an ally that doesn't necessarily identify as part of that group, I think that that ally needs to come with some kind of understanding of what what the needs are of that group and come with some kind of knowledge, because I don't think it's fair for the members of the ERG to be the educators of the allies. I just think it would function differently, like what you said. They're there to have mutual needs. Oftentimes, my husband was part of an ERG when he was working for a major utility, and they would come together because they were the only 3 people of color in that space. And it was a large utility company. And so to have someone come in and not know and expect that they're going to have to spend their time teaching them or educating them about what the issues are in that space, I think can be unfair. So I think if they were coming in with some knowledge, then I think that or being required to take some kind of, micro course or whatever would be more fair.
Well, I think one of the things, I think you bring up another important point around ERGs in any group, whether it's a diversity committee or a diversity council, is establishing norms and principles for how you're going to manage the group. So having that conversation about, how do we think about the relationship with people who want to join the team? What are the norms? What are some of the guidelines? So having spend some time thinking about those and actually documenting those as you start to build your charter and so forth. I won't go through the business case. I think most of you understand that. We'll move to the next slide just quickly. Those are just some examples of the types of ERGs. And you see there's some, I pointed out some around like generational family structures, working parents, age, even some interfaith type groups and so forth. So there are lots of ways, depending on who you are, the context in which you operate and so forth. Let's move to the next slide. Let's just move on from that. I think we kind of understand the business case. This was a survey that I just saw here about ERGs from Benevity. It just came out. The top 3 reasons employees join ERGs: connect with a colleague with a similar lived experience. So lived experience is very important here. To connect with a team, to connect or learn from colleagues with a okay, go to the next slide. Okay. With a different lived experience, and to become better, to be a better ally to diverse colleagues. So just some of the top reasons people join ERGs. Let's go to the next slide. There's some other interesting information here. The positive impact of belonging. ERGs create a positive impact on belonging. You can kind of read through this to give you a sense of the positive impact and the % of employees who agree with that statement based on their survey. I can't read it here, so I'll let you read it for a moment. And take a moment and look at that. Anybody would disagree or support that claim? Any of you who have ERGs? Yes.
So in my previous role, I actually led all of our ERGs. We had 9 of them, and what we did with metrics is data, and so important, right? Is a lot of companies, they have employee engagement surveys every year, and they tell you how engaged your employees are, how they feel like they belong or whatnot. But something we were able to do is actually take the information for our ERGs and compare that versus the non-ERG members, and we found that our ERGs had a higher percentage of belonging and engagement and all that. So whenever you're able to do that, leadership's gonna be like, "Oh wow, these people are more engaged. So what we need to do more with that." So
that's a very good point. A couple of things. Their experience was higher, but they also are ERGs are a good group when you're doing employee surveys. If you dice out or tease out your data by demographic groups, and you've got an ERG with that demographic group, and there are some challenges or some opportunities, let's say, based on the survey data, one of the things you can do is to perhaps ask that group to provide some additional insight and input into that, into those findings and so forth. Any other thoughts? Yes.
Yes, I would love your good morning, by the way. I would
Good morning.
love your opinion on this because I've also heard ERG participation being low in some organizations, and it's typically organizations that are understaffed. And ERGs can start to feel like just another thing they have to do. And so, my question to you is how do you build that engagement and that with them, like what's in it for employees to even participate so it doesn't feel like just another task?
That's a very important point too. And what you find oftentimes is that there's a small group of leaders, even within those employee resource groups, that sort of drive the ERG agenda and so forth. One of the things I would say is, and I talk about that later in the slides, and I'm not going to try to just go through the slides. I'd rather have the conversation and the dialogue with you, so I'll just jump to some. But just having an annual calendar, starting to build out kind of, okay, what's our agenda for the year in terms of priorities, focus, and participation, and don't try to assign it to just a small group of people. Try to distribute the work across the ERG and so forth. And the other part of it is whether or not you're all in the same spot. One of the challenges, you may have an organization which has all of its employees in one location. That's a little bit easier than if you've got people scattered around in different locations and so forth. So you have to think about that as well. So there's no one way to address this, but let me just ask, some of you who have ERGs, how have you dealt with that issue in terms of participation? What I have seen, and I saw it with the ERGs at Weyerhaeuser back in the day, there was a cyclicality to interest, depending on some of the priorities that the ERG set, whether it was a special program that they were putting together, you generally tended to get more interest and activity. But in the day-to-day kind of keeping the ERG going, it became a little bit challenging. The key is having really strong leadership and not placing all the burden on one leader to do it all. Just trying to spread that around as a team, a leadership team. Let me ask Krispy Kreme. You've got ERGs. Tell me a little bit about what you've done.
Great segue.
So, alrighty. So, what have we done? So, I'm gonna talk kind of more high level, not just specifically at Krispy Kreme, but just kind of how I look at ERGs. For when we're looking at employee resource groups, I think one of the things that I have talked with our ERG leaders is that there's a difference between those who are members and leaders of the group and those who are coming to your events to seek education, right? So when we're talking about participation, I think there's a couple ways to look at it. Are you just tracking it because you're looking at the number of people who are coming to monthly meetings? Or are you tracking your engagement by those who are participating in events? So, for example, if your Black ERG is putting on an event around Black History Month or Juneteenth or Kwanzaa, how are you inviting those who are the non-identity groups in that to participate and learn about that experience? One of the struggles that I currently have is our leaders have gotten into this notion that they need to have a monthly member meeting. And what they were starting to see is a lot of participation wane over time. But what it was is that and to your point about being understaffed, we are a lean organization, right? And so that creating that with them, like they were like, people start out strong in January, but by like May, nobody's showing up. Okay, well, if your meeting is only, hey, here are the events we have coming up, and here are the events we've done, and what else do you want to talk about? There's no with them, right? You have to create the urgency of now. What's the fear of missing out, right? So now they have started to get into, because also they were having their monthly member meetings and then they were doing events on top of that. And so you were having the ERGs doing their member meeting, and then probably an event or two a month. And so the calendar just got really full. So then what I said is, let's actually focus in. You have a monthly member meeting, make those meetings topical, right? So if I miss the March meeting, then I'm going to miss that discussion. And then you create the urgency of now for why somebody should be coming to that conversation. Now, it may be a conversation that is more directed to the in-group members, and it might be a conversation that's more for the general population. And that's okay. Not every meeting has to be for the general population. You can create topics that are going to be specific to that group. But the other thing you also need to make sure is, how are you continuing to use that as engagement to get people involved, right? And so I'm hoping I was answering what you were hoping to look for in this. But that is, we need to make sure that we're being really honest about what are the KPIs we're using to measure success of our ERGs, right? Also, what our ERGs are not. They are not your policy creators. Right? Your ERGs are there to create and boost engagement of your employees. You should be using your annual engagement survey to be tracking how people are engaged, and are your employee resource groups adding to engagement in your organization. But your ERGs are not there to write your gender pay gap analysis policy. Your employee resource groups are not there to write your family leave policy. They are there to advocate that that policy happens. But my job as the Chief Diversity Officer is to write that policy. Don't put paid work on the backs of employee resource group leaders who are not getting paid to do that job. This is a volunteer job, right? The work that needs to be done, that is paid work, has to be paid. And so make sure that you're really understanding where does the responsibility and accountability of the ERG start and stop, and where does that accountability of the paid folks who need to do this work start and stop as well. Now I'm going to get off my soapbox.
Okay, great. Yes, comment here?
I think a lot of it has to do with how you're defining the purpose of the group. And as the person responsible for DEI in our organization, I'm clear that I'm responding to the need of our staff that they've articulated to have a voice in shaping how we do inclusion in a way that is actually inclusive, and not just top down, but also bottom up. So what we're trying to do is to clarify for leaders somewhat what he just said, is that you can't ask people who have a full-time job to take on another full-time job and expect that to just happen overnight and you snap your fingers. I'm constantly saying to our leadership, this takes time to implement. You cannot just go from 0 to 60 overnight. And so that's a huge challenge in terms of level setting expectations for ERGs. What do we expect to be the result of being a participant in an ERG? And for us, what I hear from our staff is that I want them to feel like they have a voice, that they have an ability to help to shape what we're doing in terms of inclusion. And if we hit that metric, then we are our ERGs are functioning as we hope they would. And so we've created a pathway for all our ERG leaders to sit and communicate with our belonging and inclusion oversight group, so that they know that if something's not hitting right or landing right with that particular group, they have a place where they can address that in terms of creating inclusion. So I think it's different for every organization based on what the purpose of the ERG is. And you've articulated that there's a broad range of purposes that can be.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. It really depends on how you're structuring the ERGs in your company, how it fits with your strategies with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how do they relate to kind of the mission of the organization as a whole. One of the reasons really is to provide employees, to your point, with a voice in terms of, decisions, things that affect them, how to even inform some of the things that the organization is doing. Some of the ERGs that I've seen have actually been asked to provide input on, for example, product development or service delivery, or in terms of marketing and so forth. And if they're getting ready to introduce a new marketing concept and it's targeted at a particular community and you've got an ERG that's in that community, ask that community, are we approaching this correctly? What feedback would you give us as well? So it all depends on how you're structuring it and the maturity of the group. The other thing I would say that you don't want to just silo your ERGs. If you've got more than one, how many of you have more than one ERG? One of the things that we did at Weyerhaeuser was to create an ERG kind of council. And the reason for creating the council, the ERG council, was to have the groups collaborate with each other across differences, so that as they plan activities, that you don't kind of get everything kind of bottlenecked with a whole lot of activities with a lot of groups at the same time, and to help each other, because oftentimes with this waning of activity in one group, you could reach out, for example, to the women's group or to the LGBT group or to the Asian group or the people with disabilities group, if you've got those, and say, let's talk together and let's put together a strategy and agenda for the year so that we're pacing ourselves across these groups during the year. Yes, back here.
I just wanted to make a comment that sort of deals with a lot of the issues that you all are talking about, and that's, I cannot tell you how important it is for you to understand what the purpose of your ERG is, because that will drive everything else.
Yeah.
I thought about this, and you just happened to mention bringing groups together. University of Georgia Black group, faculty and staff, decided to get together with the LGBTQ plus group just for purposes of providing support when it was needed. Okay, I don't need a monthly meeting for that. You got something you need me to do? Okay, we can get together for that. But I don't have time for monthly meetings just because we're a group. And we had somebody, this goes to the issue of how much you expect people to do and where you expect them to be on the ally kind of thing. We had somebody from the black group who walked in and said, I don't agree with this LGBTQ plus stuff because like my religion tells me that that's like not a good thing. But that person was head of diversity for one of the parts of the university, but was very supportive for the kind of stuff the group needed when they came together. So you really can't afford to dismiss anybody. You don't want people who are going to be disruptive to what the group is actually for. And believe me, I nearly laid out on the floor when he made that statement, especially since it had been one of my students in an employment law course. But at the same time, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. ERGs, the thing I love about them is that they are separate and apart, but under the organization. You get to pretty much shape it the way you want to. Once you do that shaping, don't be afraid to change the shaping if it turns out your needs are different. If you don't need monthly meetings, you just need people to come together, for instance, for policy issues, that's all you need them for, especially when it's something that may be time consuming otherwise. It's one of the few places in a workplace where you get to craft what it is that meets your needs. This isn't some policy on top and everybody's got to fit into it. You're coming together because you see that there's a need that you have, and you get to shape what that picture looks like. And the people who are in it, and those people will not always be clean, shiny folk that, go along with every single idea you have, but they can still have a place in that organization.
Thank you. I think there was a gentleman back here.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion. Michael Bloom with a small company in Houston. So I guess the question is kind of two parts. One is, as a member of a very small company, less than 30 people, and then also as a potential like consultant helping people, other companies figure this out, what's the size threshold? Like I'm trying to picture 30 people dividing up into ERGs. Like that's silly. Weyerhaeuser is really big. A lot of these companies here are really big.
Very good question. I've been working with a number of architectural firms, very smaller firms, about how to advance their DEI framework and how to think about it and what's the role of these ERGs in the organization. Some organizations have gone to multicultural ERGs. So it doesn't mean that you have to focus on one identity-based groups. It could be an intersectional type of ERG, which has several different identities based on it. Other companies have formed what's called the Diversity Council. And the Diversity Council is sort of an umbrella organization that sort of there's a rotating shift every 2 years. Someone comes and they help to provide guidance to the organization about a variety of its practices, not just the climate, the culture, but they also even extend to things like how do we think about growth in terms of our business, building it more and linking it more to the business strategy of the organization as a whole. And that's what we're seeing now is a tighter connection with ERGs and diversity councils and so forth, expanding their input and their thinking and requests to cover things that go beyond the culture and the workplace, and allowing their voices to be heard, whether it's in the design of a new product and service, whether it's how to market to a particular customer, or how to enhance community relations, or be engaged with talent management, talent recruitment, and so forth. So there are lots of different ways. It just depends on your organization, your culture, your size, the context, the other priorities that you have as a business. But very good question. And there is an opportunity at a smaller firm to have some form of an ERG or a diversity council. Yes, right here.
Thank you. I just wanted to tap into what Don was saying in terms of the flexibility of the ERGs. So we created our terms of reference to be very, very fluid in terms of how people approach the leadership. We had the one that was for under 5 years of service. They had like the chair, and then they had a past chair, and they had a very traditional style of doing things. The women's group had a co-chair model, and then we created an indigenous ERG while I was there, and that didn't fly for them. I mean, they called it a circle, they didn't call it an ERG, and they had a very shared leadership style. And so that flexibility of thinking about the identities and not putting a prescriptive way of doing that, I think is really, really important. But my question is around your thoughts. We had executive sponsors, so a senior leader attached to every ERG, sort of as an ally, I suppose, and try to align it with their interests, but really to create that line of communication between this sort of frontline group, essentially having a connection and a support at the senior table. Do you see value in having executive sponsorship that could sort of be a place for them to have access to leadership in that way?
Well, we actually had executive sponsors for each of our ERGs, because we felt that one of the roles of ERGs was to provide feedback and input to leadership on things that could improve the culture, improve the business, and so forth. And in many cases, some of the things that the ERGs wanted to do required resources and funding and support. And it's easier to get those things done and supported if you've got an executive sponsor who can go to bat for you. So I do believe that executive sponsors are an important part of the process. And typically, the way that we arrived at that was the group, once it formed and sort of developed its charter, and there's a chartering process that talks about what's the mission of the group, what's the activities, those things that you do in terms of how we're going to operate, how will we select leadership for the group, all of that, and it differed by different groups. All of those things are important, and then developing sort of the norms. How are we going to operate? When are we going to meet? How long will we meet? And so forth. Who's going to scribe the meeting notes? How are we going to plan events and put together an annual calendar? Those are things that the group should really spend time thinking about, so that you get sort of the infrastructure in place to have a sustainable ERG. But I do, to your point, I do believe executive sponsorship is an important part of it. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the discussion. So I'm from France, and I always tell people that we're probably 30 years behind when it comes to diversity and inclusion. 50, let's say 50. So what I notice in companies is that management, on the one hand, doesn't really want to create ERGs because they're scared that it's going to divide the collective. And on the other hand, I noticed that employees sometimes don't really want to disclose parts of their identities. They don't want to be discriminated against. So let's say they're not going to be willing to be part of the women's group or whatever group. So I'm wondering, like, how do you go beyond that? Like, how do you respond to these fears?
That's a very good question, and let me bring you back to the discussion yesterday on creating a framework, in terms of how you think about this. Part of the way I think more sustainable efforts are is you spend some time working with your HR, your leadership team, your chief diversity officer to create the overall framework for diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies within the organization. And in that framework, generally, you look at where are the opportunities to do good, and how do you invite the voices of the employees to be a part of what you're doing. And so as you shape that framework, it helps you to justify and to get the leadership attention when you could say this. By having, we need a voice. If you're talking about talent management, if for example, one of the pillars that you're going to work on very aggressively in the organization is talent development, talent retention, and you want to make sure it's done in a way that's representative and equitable across all employee groups, then these employee groups really serve as a voice, to your point, to provide input. For example, he says, we're not finding these kinds of people for our jobs. Why is that happening? Well, who are you talking to? Do you have a group inside that can help you think about that? Or you may have an issue with turnover, right? And you say, why are all of our African-American engineers leaving the company? Well, why don't you ask them? Why don't you organize a group? And if you're not asking them, you may find that there are some things that you can solve by changing how you think about things, changing behavior. You may have leaders that are just not inclusive. So, there are lots of ways to kind of rationalize it, but I think the better way to do it, the best way to do it in my view, is to really lean it back to the mission of the organization, the vision and values and so forth, and looking at where those great opportunities for improvement are. And that's where this whole tool in terms of the gap analysis, when you go through, and as we went through yesterday and looked at how do you find out when you do that assessment, where are our biggest opportunities, and then you see those and then ask the question from a group that could provide input. Those employee resource groups are excellent sources to do that, and that's how you start to build those as a part of the infrastructure of what I'd call a holistic approach to DEI in the organization.
Can I respond to that?
Sure.
There's a couple of things to be really aware of, right? One is to your question, every other question, like, our firms are so different. Companies are so different. So the key is, I think, is understanding your firm, right? Understanding the culture, understanding the environment, understanding the appetite for ERGs, as well as what they can and what they can't do, and the perspective from the leadership team. So, we can, not everything works for everyone, right? But just the key is understanding what your firm, organization, the culture environment there, and the culture environment and the mentality of your leadership team. Do you understand those two things about how ERGs work? Then you can go a very far way with it.
And I'd say to that as well, that understanding your leadership, there are some people who argue that why do we need ERGs, right? Why do we want to separate groups? And there's that level of thinking out there. So you have to meet your leadership where they are, and you have to build a program of development, consciousness raising and so forth to help them understand the business imperative for doing this. Yes.
Yeah, and just to add to that as well is the importance of psychological safety. If psychological safety is low, you're not going to have the engagement in those structures. And then sometimes it can be like, well, the structures weren't needed. See, nobody came to them. But if you don't feel like, that you're actually safe, that people actually care about your feedback, are implementing the feedback, then it can feel like it's not gonna give me what I need. So that's kind of something I thought about.
Wait another 30 years.
And the question I had for you was around executive sponsorship. The consulting firm that I lead, we did some work with an organization after they'd done like a culture audit, and something that came up in the audit was like people's feedback around ERGs. And so in some of the conversations we had, the people from ERGs were like, we had an executive sponsor, we never saw them this year. They never came to the meetings, they never came to the events. And so I'm curious about how executive sponsors are chosen. Is it baked into their KPIs that, what's the feedback from that relationship? Because it can be like a checkbox, but there's no accountability, because the people I spoke to were like, yeah, we didn't even feel like we could say anything because we didn't want to get in trouble or like get, punished in our career path. So.
Well, just a couple of comments I want to make to that. One, I would suggest that executive sponsor, you don't want them at all of your meetings. You want to invite them at periodic times. You might even have a scheduled check-in with them about what you're doing and to ask for their input and so forth. The other thing I'd say in terms of participation, in terms of ERGs, one of the constraints oftentimes is the supervisor of the employee who's a part of the ERG. Well, why are you going to this? Why are you going to this meeting? And you've got work to do. I don't think you need to, go off and do this. If you've got that baked into your DEI framework, it's easier to say, well, this is a part of it. If you've got an executive sponsor, that's helpful as well. So there are those differences to your point. There's not a cookie cutter approach. You've got to understand the climate, the context, the support you have for leadership within your organization as you develop them. And you don't want to develop an ERG in a vacuum. It really ought to be connected to something larger that the organization is doing. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to co-sign on everything you said, because that was the exact process as a result of doing the ISO 3415, implementing that we used to develop our ERGs. And the ERGs did not come out in a vacuum. They're a direct response to our inclusion statement that was developed by our staff. And one of the statements that we were striving for was to create a safe space where employees could be themselves. And so the ERGs are our attempt to create that safe space, as well as to give them a voice. And we left the decision of whether they wanted to have an executive sponsor or not to the group. You don't have to have one. If you want one, it's your choice to determine if that's the case, and you can have one or not.
One of the things that ERGs, that we use ERGs for, was to help shape understanding of the business strategies in the organization for that particular demographic, because oftentimes individuals in that group may not have been in a position or in a department where they got a good appreciation for the work that's going on in that organization. So one of the things that some of the ERGs would do would be to say, we want to learn more about this evolving technology in this aspect of our business, and we want it brought to us as a community so we can understand it, and so our people can understand how they may need to shift their skills and capabilities to respond to that. So I've got the signal that we got about 5 more minutes or so, but that's what I would tell you as well, that don't think about it as just about, what's in it for me, but think about it as how can we help the organization be better at what it does, and how can we learn about that by engaging with leaders in the organization who we may not get exposed to. So, on some of the planned meetings, there was a fairly senior executive. You would invite them in, and they would speak about and have a dialogue like we're having here about what they're doing and so forth. So those are some other ways to think about these groups. Other thoughts, other questions? I know I had a long deck here, and my intent wasn't necessarily to just walk you through it. It's available. I'll make it available for the participants, because a lot of what you've shared is covered in there. Yes.
Yeah, just because it sounds like you're not going to go through the whole deck. I did see something on there that I do want to comment on.
Sure.
Is about metrics.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how many people are familiar, but there's not a lot of ERG metrics out there, right? But Dr. Robert Rodriguez developed the 4C model.
Mm-hmm.
4C's career, culture, commerce, and community. And actually what's nice is you can have your ERGs focus on those 4 C's, and he actually has an assessment that your ERGs can take to let you know how they're doing in comparison to 500 other ERGs that he has in his database. And the information can be dissected by industry as well as by ERG demographic or just by all of the ERGs. It's actually really, really good. And just to give you an idea what the 4C stands for, career is like your development in the career of the workforce that you're in. Culture is bringing culture into the workforce. So like for Black History Month, Pride Month, all those good stuff. Commerce is what you just shared about how are the ERGs helping the business. And then community is volunteering in the diverse communities that are out there. But it's a really good framework, as you mentioned before, to have ERGs focus on this, because for those that have experience with ERGs, you can know that they're going to want to do like 8 million things, and they can't. They have to really focus. But it's a really helpful tool and model. But I just wanted to share that with everyone.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? Well, I'll just summarize with a couple of comments about ERGs. One, when you start it out, don't legislate it. Really look at a groundswell. Employees will want to come, create an environment where people will come and say, we want to create an ERG around a particular identity-based characteristic, number one. Number two, as they come forward, really help them understand how to go through a chartering process. Have some guidelines around, what should be the role of an ERG. What are the ground rules for establishing an ERG in terms of what's in, what's out. Because sometimes ERGs will tend to move into what I call HR or labor relations types of issues. You want to really set some parameters around the type of work that an ERG can do. Develop a charter. That's, what's our mission? What do we hope to achieve? What are some operating norms for the group? And then build an annual calendar in terms of topics and so forth, and align it with your organization's commitment statement, your DEI strategies, and so forth. And I think the more closely connected with those things, I think the more sustainable your ERG will be. Yes.
Just a quick question in terms of where the ERGs so-called report into, like who is their point of contact within the organization when you have HR and you have a DEI team, if you will? Does it make the most sense that that is their point of contact in terms of helping them create their charter when they navigating issues beyond their sponsor? Where do they kind of
generally in most organizations, it's the chief diversity officer, or if they have people on their staff, it's someone on their staff that helps that. In other cases, it can be someone in the HR department to help support that. Those would be the two. Anybody have different people that support these ERGs? Krispy Kreme, how are you sort of? I'm going to ask you again. You're back to back.
So the employee resource groups sit under my responsibility, right? I am the one who provides their budget. And so that they're so it sits within the belonging space. They all have executive sponsorship, especially for when my budget runs out for them. They know where to go to ask for more money. But also the executive sponsors are there for when decisions are being made at the executive committee level. When we are not in the room, they are there to be their advocate, right? And so that's how we are organized.
Great. All right, so we're wrapping up right now. So the last point I would make is to take your time. Don't rush into it. Build the infrastructure carefully at the beginning, the charter. the roles and responsibilities, kind of how you want to meet the operating norms for the committee, and maybe 2 or 3 priorities, and link them to where the greatest challenges are in the organization in terms of talent acquisition, perhaps, talent development, talent retention. Also looking at things like culture, maybe focusing on helping to inform the results of employee engagement surveys, those kinds of things. And also offering up to provide a perspective about a product or service that you're doing as an organization as a whole. So don't think about it as just contained within culture and demographics and so forth. Think about it in terms of this is a lens in which you should be looking at everything that you do as an organization, and you need that voice. I like the word, the voice of that community to help inform that. So thank you very much. The slides will be available to you, and if you have any more questions offline, just feel free to let me know. Thank you.